Afternoon. We are at that awkward part of the afternoon when the blood is rushing to the stomach and digesting the food, and it's difficult to keep track of dreary economics conversations. But I'm very confident that the panel that we have here will keep you alert and active. And the topic as well is, of course, of great interest, and it's a very timely one. And when we talk about globalization and new horizons in the world economy, we can't have that conversation without having a look at one of the critical pillars of the current international architecture, which is all the Bretton Woods institutions and the systems and policies and frameworks around it. So obviously, the Bretton Woods system, the collection of institutions that were set up after 1945, and various other parts of it have evolved with time. So it's not like those institutions have not changed. The question is whether they have changed quickly enough, and whether the pace of change with the surge in China and complicated by the rise of other powers as well, makes the current system less efficient and less workable. So the question is, where is the Bretton Woods system heading? And has the time come for transformational changes rather than the incremental changes that we have seen, or the slow evolution that we have seen in the last couple of decades? So to help us understand these challenges and how they might change over time, we have a panel of three illustrious economic thinkers from diverse backgrounds. We will start first with Ms. Michaela Marcussen, who's Chief Economist for Société Générale Bank, but she has had extensive experience in international banking and asset management and can give the perspective from Europe. After that, we will have Dr. Khor, who is Chief Economist of the ASEAN Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Office, an economic surveillance and research organization established to support and complement the Chiang Mai initiative, which in turn evolved as a response to the weaknesses in the Bretton Woods system that were exposed during the Asian financial crisis. And before this, he worked with the IMF as well as with the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And finally, we have Dr. Leslie Teo, who is Chief Economist of GIC, which is Singapore's sovereign wealth fund. But prior to this, he also served in the IMF as well as the Monetary Authority of Singapore. So we'll have about maybe 10 minutes for each speaker. Hopefully they will provoke us with very interesting and bold ideas. And then we'll have a conversation that will be thrown open to the floor. So please, as you listen to the speakers, please get your questions ready so that we can have a very interesting back and forth conversation after their presentations. So let's start maybe with Michaela. Thank you.
So thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here today. When I first got the invitation to talk about the Swan song of Bretton Woods, I actually thought the Swan song happened 38 years ago, because I learned in economic lessons that, you know, the system broke down in 1971. But of course, what we're here to discuss today, as Manu very, very eloquently put it, is really about the institutions that were created. And I think it's interesting just to remind ourselves that going into the Bretton Woods negotiations, there are really two key lessons that were taken into those talks. The first was from the 1920s. In the 1920s, disorderly capital flows, investment, volatile capital flows, large imbalances, this was really a major concern at the time. And the second lesson was that the protectionism and the beggar thy neighbor policies of the 1930s did a huge amount of economic damage. So I think it's important to see that it was with these two ideas in mind that Bretton Woods took shape. And of course, we all know the history, a system of fixed exchange rates, and of course, the setting up of the IMF, importantly to help address temporary imbalances, and also the idea to promote fair and free trade. But I think the most important thing was really the idea of making sure that we had peace. And I think it's also interesting as a European to think about the fact that when the European institutions were initially set up, it was a very similar thinking behind them. The idea to promote free and fair trade, avoid beggar thy neighbor policies, but again, this key idea of securing peace. So we heard a lot of very interesting speakers this morning go over the various performances of this system, which has governed much of our own economic history as we all sit here in this room today. And of course, you know, we have to recognize we have not had a new world war. And it seems maybe a rather sort of obvious thing to state, but I think it's an important thing to remind ourselves of. We also heard this morning that we've reduced poverty, that there's less inequality amongst nations, because one of the perceptions was that it was inequality amongst nations that led to conflict and war. And we've also had far less destructive trade wars. Now, I sort of felt a little bit uneasy as I put that into my notes, because I'm sitting here when we have President Trump and China and tensions and threats of European and Japanese cars being a threat to national security in the US. And if anyone can help me on that in the coffee break, how a Mercedes-Benz become a national security threat, I'd be immensely grateful, because I still haven't quite understood it. And also, you know, when we look at the resolution of the crisis, there was a lot of cooperation. But there has been a lot of cracks in the system, and we touched upon many of them this moment. Again, volatile capital flows, and we saw that with many of the crises in the emerging markets, as we also heard this morning. High debt levels, and I think this is an important point to keep in mind. Inequality and populism. And I think what's of particular relevance also to our discussion on this panel is the question of dollar dominance. We live today in a world of dollar dominance. And I think this dollar dominance, it's not just about capital flows, debt, but it's also becoming a question of geopolitics. We've seen how the dollar has been institutionalized to also be effective of sanctions. You know, as a banker, sometimes I feel like the compliance officer for Donald Trump, because that's my new job. So you can see that this is really important. Now, of course, the question is always, so what should we do? How should we move forward? Should we change the IMF? I probably wouldn't change the IMF per se, but I think institutions are really, really important. This morning we had the opportunity to touch upon the WTO. And I think having institutions that can work together, the G20, work together on key issues such as climate change, this is extremely important. But I think we have those institutions. I think the key question is what we do with them. But I would also say that there are a couple of other institutions that I worry about. And linking into the theme of inequality this morning, I'd like to throw in two thoughts. Inequality is not just a question of individuals. We've also seen a significant increase in inequality amongst companies, and especially in the United States. And when we think about one of the successes in Europe, it's actually been the European antitrust. The organization of the antitrust institutions have been much more successful in Europe, even though we initially took the idea from the US. And if you look in the US, you see that that power has been reduced. So you have much more inequality between companies. And in that case, it's maybe not quite so surprising that you also get more inequality between workers. And with that point, I'll say something, you know, at the risk of shocking some of my European colleagues. I would also say that one of the institutions, I don't think I'll shock my minister here, but some of the institutions, some of you I may shock a little bit, but I think one of the institutions that we're really missing in the puzzle today are the trade unions. In fact, I've been quite surprised that we've had a full morning of discussion and we haven't discussed about trade unions. Now, if you look at union memberships and you look at countries that have high union memberships, that also correlates quite nicely to countries where the profit share of GDP tends to be lower and you have more equality between the workers. Now, of course, if you ask me what unions I want modern unions. I want unions that are helping in a positive way to ensure lifelong learning, to ensure the flexibility of the workforce, but also to ensure fair wages and to ensure that we address some of the inequality issues. And finally, we also touched a little bit upon taxation this morning, and I think that's another important one. But I wanted to come back to the question of dollar dominance and the question of the currency order, because I think that relates in particular to this panel. And I'd like to suggest to you that a new currency order is needed today. But I think it has to be a multi-currency order. I don't think it can be just a question of one currency dominating. And I think I was very happy to see the initiative coming out of Europe to create an international role for the euro. I think it's very important. And I don't think it's about taking away from the US dollar per se. I think it's about creating a more balanced system. But I think it's true in the case of China as well, that we need to create a stronger international role for the RMB. And if we dig a little bit further and we look at the type of reforms that are necessary to develop both the RMB and, or CNY, sorry, and the euro into an international currency, this actually ties in very strongly with many of the structural reforms that are needed to actually move those countries to higher potential growth. Let's just take the example of Europe. You know, when we think of the international role of the euro, we have to remember it's not just about trade, it's also about finance. And I would argue, and you know, just ignore the fact that I'm a banker for a moment, but I would argue that the finance side of it is perhaps even more important than the trade side, although both go hand in hand. So what do we need? We need to finalize our banking union. It's about creating a European deposit, but more important, it's about creating single jurisdiction. We need a capital markets union. We also need to move further ahead on some kind of fiscal authority and a safe asset for the euro area. Now, for the Europeans in this room, you'll probably, like myself, go to many conferences, and we all make the long list every time, and we can all pretty much agree that we need this to be done. But of course, as Draghi reminded us last week, it's very difficult to do this. But I think Draghi also said something very important at the ECB meeting last week. He reminded us once again that for monetary policy to be effective, we need to make sure that the institutions are working well. And in the case of Europe, that means addressing the issue of fragmentation. And I think time is short, and it's very critical. And I think one of the final things we should take from this world of dollar dominance and of debt dominance is two ideas. One, I think we need more equity and far less debt. So we need to think about how we're treating debt. And I think this is where macroprudential policies become extremely important as well. But again, they need to be well organized, and more importantly, they need to be well understood. And in that case, I think it's really important that we also consider how we can stop overburdening the central banks. But I would argue if we move to a world of more equity, less debt, if we move to a world where we have three important currencies, I think in such a situation, we could actually start to foster a better world order, a more stable world order, and with that, actually return more enthusiasm to our international institutions. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michaela, for those excellent points and also for being precisely on time, which is great. Can I now turn to Dr. Khor, please?
Hello? Okay. Okay, thank you for inviting me to this forum. Okay, so I'm going, you know, as Manu said, I used to work at the fund, and now I'm working for AMRO. AMRO, a lot of people, even at lunch, I was asked what AMRO is. It's a lot of people think it's ABN AMRO, but actually it's an international organization set up in Asia. So one way to think of AMRO is that it's an alternative to the IMF, right? Or it's the reincarnation of AMF, the Asian Monetary Fund, that was shot down many years ago during the Asian financial crisis when it was, suggested by Japan. So lo and behold, 20 years later, we have AMRO and CMIM, and it's not quite AMF yet, but we're getting there. So the role of AMRO is to provide the surveillance and the policy support for GMI, the CMIM. And I say this because I think that, the question is whether the Bretton Woods system is still effective. And the reason why AMRO CMIM was set up is precisely because there are problems with the existing system. And I think, the G20 Eminent Persons Group just issued a report about the governance of the global international financial institution, and basically identify problems with the system, which is that the system, in a way, is too strict to the point where it is actually inhibiting growth in developing countries, especially emerging markets. And the IMF has evolved over the years. I joined the IMF in 1981, and when I look back at what the IMF is today compared to 1981, it has actually gone through a lot of changes. And as Michaela said, it went through several crises in the 70s, in the 80s with the Latin American debt crisis, and then in the 90s, the Asian financial crisis, and then the global financial. And each time, the IMF had to reinvent itself to make itself relevant. Because the IMF, like the WTO and the World Bank, are basically rule-setting body. They set policies, best practices. And after a while, these rules just break down, right? They don't stop working, because the world has changed. So after the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system in the 70s, you have liberalization of capital accounts, you have capital flows, and then you have this massive inflow of bank lending to Latin America, and after a while, the banks have to be bailed out. And then in the 90s, we have again a similar phenomenon in Asia, where you have another big influx of capital. And this time the balance sheet was a big problem, and the IMF was not set up to actually manage that kind of a problem. So if you look at the record of the IMF, there has been a series of crises over the years, and the IMF was not there to prevent it. So one can sort of blame the IMF, but each time the IMF has tried to reinvent itself and make itself relevant again. And they have revised their policies, for instance, on capital flows, on exchange rate intervention, on macroprudential policies, and to their credit, I think the IMF is a lot more ready now to deal with the kind of shocks that we saw during the Asian financial crisis and the global financial crisis. Of course, for the financial system, we now have the FSF and also the BIS subcommittees that set best standards. You have Basel I, Basel II, Basel III. They're all set up to prevent this kind of crisis from re-emerging again. So the system has been evolving over time, and Asia, as you heard this morning, is a great fan of globalization, even though they were hurt very badly during the Asian financial crisis. And they have taken actually the lessons of the Asian financial crisis to heart. They actually work very hard to try to strengthen their own domestic economic fundamentals, the regulatory framework, the policy framework they put in place, best practices in terms of inflation targeting and all that. And all the time they have remained open in terms of the trade regime, right? And actually that has helped to support and the recovery after the Asian financial crisis. And then with the emergence of China, we have again another big driver of globalization that took place from the 2001 until recently. So Asia definitely has benefited from globalization, and despite all the flaws of the international financial system, they have stayed with it. But I think everybody recognizes there is a problem with the IMF in the sense that there's a stigma involved in IMF, and although the IMF tries to be even-handed, I think the perception in the region has been that the IMF, by and large, is biased towards the creditor countries. I mean, during the Latin American crisis, they were basically, debt collectors for the banks in Latin America. I think that changed over the years, and now, so for a while, you cannot have a program if you have an arrears. You must, pay back your debt, right? Now, of course, there's more distribution of the cost of a crisis between creditor and borrower. But even so, I think, there's a perception that the IMF is not fully even-handed. And I think after the global financial crisis, it also turned out that against the big boys, the US, Europe, the IMF has not been very effective in terms of enforcing so-called best practices. You have ultra-easy monetary policy, you have massive surge of capital into emerging markets, and which caused a lot of havoc and volatility to the emerging markets. And that's the background for setting up the AMRO and the CMIM, because there is an issue, right? And it's systemic. You have these volatile capital flows, and countries have been trying very hard in the region, at least, to strengthen the fundamentals, build up the buffer to make sure that they are resilient against these volatility shocks. And by and large, I think the region has done pretty well. If you look back in the last 5 years with the taper tantrum, the market volatility after Trump was elected, and most recently, in October, countries like Indonesia, Philippines, were very proactive. They immediately raised interest rate to try to maintain stability, right? So in terms of resilience, I think that the region has actually done extremely well, but at the cost of growth, because they've been trying to save, and because they've been strengthening the fundamentals. I think they've underinvested in infrastructure, in capacity for growth, and as a result, although the region is still one of the fastest growing regions in the world, it can do even better. And this is why I think you need to reform the international organization in order to be able to support countries' ability to grow. So we have done some simulation, and the World Bank has done some estimation of the gap, and it turns out that the gap is about 2.5 percentage points of GDP to 3%. If you can just fill that gap, you can easily raise potential growth by another 1 percentage point, or thereby. It varies across from country to country, right? But it does show that the system is not able to address that kind of the issue. I know there was a suggestion about crowding, using equity more than debt. I think that's great, but I doubt if equity will be able to fill in the gap. It's just too big for. But the region is quite fortunate in the sense that as a region as a whole is a surplus region. If you look at the savings investment, it's actually a big surplus, and much of the surplus was invested in the West, and then it comes back to the region through portfolio flows and FDI. More recently, I think there's been a lot more FDI investment within the region itself. But I think there's more that can be done, and this is where I think initiative like the Belt and Road Initiative comes in, and also the Japanese Quality Infrastructure Program. Because if the region can harness the savings that's already here in the region, they can close the gap on investment and raise the capacity for growth and potential growth. So I think that's very important. So I think at the end of the day, you ask whether the Bretton Woods system is broken. Well, it has been broken several times, and every time we try to fix it, but the institution needs to be supplemented by other institutions, and so now we have a proliferation of regional institutions in the region. You have the AIIB, you have the BRI, you have the Quality Infrastructure, and of course you have the ASEAN Economic community and all the different FTA between different countries. You need that additional institution and framework in order to support the system, because the system has become quite complex and difficult for just one institution to manage. But we still need, I think, some rule-setting body, for just like the WTO, even though it's not been very effective over the years, but it sets the ground rule for everyone. And this ground rule needs to be reviewed and needs to be changed over time. But I think they play a very important role. And institutions like AMRO and CMIM basically complement the IMF institution. On the role of the US dollar, I agree that we need to diversify away from excessive dependence on US dollar. And within the region, there's been a growing increase of local currency, right? But I think we shouldn't state the problem in terms of the dollar, because I think that if you look back, the Asian financial crisis was a crisis of currency mismatch, and after that, the region actually tried to develop local currency bond market, and so you eliminate the currency mismatch, right? But you still have a problem because you have very volatile capital flows that come in and out, and when they leave, you need to have sufficient reserve in order to be able to support your currency. And in the region, because a lot of the currencies are still back to the dollar to different degrees, right? Whenever there's a change in U.S. monetary policy, you see the effect ripple through the region. I think over time this has diminished because exchange rates are now a lot more flexible than before, but it's still there, and to the extent that the currencies are more flexible, and you have development of other currencies, I think it will help to improve the resilience of the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Hoey. Leslie, please.
Thank you, Manu. Probably three economists talking to you right after lunch is a very difficult task to bear. I'm going to take a slightly different tack. I just want to make one point. I will be happy to talk about the economics in a way, and maybe the questions like the dollar. But I wanted to make a different point, a broader point, to answer the question whether we have a swan song for the Bretton Woods. My basic answer is that more than ever before, we do need the Bretton Woods organizations, meaning the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, and their cousins. But more than ever before, in a way, they are somewhat irrelevant. I'm making it stronger than perhaps it should be, just because I want to wake everyone up. But, and what do I mean by that? Because what I mean by that is just a focus on ideas and globalization. I'm not sure if you've been following the 737 MAX 8, but to me, there are many interesting things about that, including lessons in crisis management. But one interesting thing is the democratization of data and the fact that the US FTA is not considered to be the leader, right? That is a big change. In the past, you would just believe in their word and do what they say. But, you could say China had maybe ulterior motives, I don't know, but Singapore, Europe, well, Europe, you could say maybe have ulterior motives. But the fact that the Canadians changed their mind, the fact that the data is there for you to change your mind is different from the past. So here's how I would try to make my argument. Simple model. What is globalization, or what does globalization involve? There were, in my mind, 4 things. It's about the movement of goods and services, the movement of finance or capital. It's about ideas, and it's about the movement of people. We set up institutions. I mean, globalization, in a way, it's a recent phenomenon, right, in human history. But over time, we've set up different rules to prevent many of these things. And then we set up institutions to liberalize, to have some global rules around them. And the Bretton Woods system, as Nicola helpfully reminded us, was a response to stopping certain things that made collective good not possible, response to war, because all of us want to live in a planet, I guess, with peace and prosperity. So you had goods and services, WTO, or GATT, then WTO. Then we had the Bretton Woods, World Bank, IMF, Capital and Finance. And since this was a big task, even though the UN had some role, immigration or people movement was usually under the purview of national governments. EU a bit more complicated. Ideas, not an issue, right? Or ideas, just as before. You had books, you had people moving around, they spread ideas. What has changed? In my view, it's ideas that are really the difference today. Right? Ideas spread very fast. They are under no one's control, really. Ideas here, to be clear, idea as a factor of production, so I can have a blueprint to a mechanical device and produce it. I can have a software, and you can say I can't export control. Many of you, some of you may remember the age when we would have software and it would say on it, not for export to certain countries. Irrelevant today. There are lots of discussions about data and data rules, and I have to say I am somewhat intrigued to believe that anyone thinks they can control this. If you want to be part of the system, of course you can control it if you want to be North Korea. So if that's the reality, then my point is really simple. Yes, trade, goods and services, still very important. Finance, still very important. Immigration or people movement, big issue. We have to deal with it. I am actually quite hopeful, and I hope that notwithstanding the rut we're in, the institutions that have been set up, the frameworks continue and they come up with a solution. But these things are made more complicated. They are, in a way, made somewhat irrelevant by the movement of ideas. Right? Because there's another, aside from, you can say, I prevent a country from exporting X, but, I could say, you can't use an iPhone, but the heart of the iPhone is a bunch of software which can be easily reproduced. But there's another aspect of ideas which is the not so much as a factor of production, as ideas change your production function. Right? So the idea here of a different capitalist system, concerns about inequality, different ways, these are ideas. They are powerful, in my view. They determine the reality in many people's minds. They can be used for good and bad, and as we know, the movement of ideas are used for both good and bad. So if again, that's I guess the context. So my argument is that yes, Bretton Woods, Swan song, no, but what really matters to many people is not just in these traditional, so I guess the more diplomatic and correct way is, it's not just this, it's this whole other avenue. And you really can't stop it. I think you can try, but it's, as we would say, the horse has left the barn, but no one is thinking hard about dealing with it. So yesterday I met with someone, a small startup in Indonesia, and we were just chatting, and a person said to me, how many people, if we go to the village in Indonesia, you ask them, do you have an internet account? They'll say, no. You ask them, do you have a Facebook account? They'll say, yes, right? Then you ask, why? Is it because of Facebook Lite, free access? No. It's because my wife or my family member or my relative is on Facebook. I cannot not be on Facebook. I personally have a Facebook account, never do anything on it. But this is the reality of the world we live in. And I guess, sorry to not talk pure economics and dollars, but I think this to me is, and the impact of, here's another example. In ASEAN, we've been talking about free trade for how many years? 20 years, Manu? 1992. Right? Our bureaucracy. Think of what Grab and Gojek does. Right? For those of you who are not familiar with Grab and Gojek, so Grab and Gojek are sort of like the Uber, except they have more things than Uber, and Gojek has actually 20 services. You can get food, you can get a massage, you can get someone come to your house, do a medical test, give you medicine, all these things. That to me is the if you like, the challenge of the order that we created in a world where technology is changing so fast and where actually ideas are the key thing, and our structures are not set up for that. Right? Governments issue press statement. How long does it take them to write a press statement? I mean, President Trump at least tweets his mind. And we know he's successful in some sense. Right? Thank you.
So thank you very much, and all the speakers kept to their time, so we have quite a bit of time left for discussion. Please get some questions ready, but let me just kick off with one very broad question. And listening to each of you, the thing that strikes me is, do we have a system, the Bretton Woods system, or whatever you want to call it, that really serves the interests of the people? I mean, at the end of the day, the financial system must serve the interests of the common man. But we have a system here where decade after decade, the Bretton Woods system, institutions and so on have failed to anticipate crises which caused incredible harm. Asian financial crisis and the more recent one. We have a system where, taking up a point that Michaela raised about how in the EU, antitrust has worked much better than in America. Is there an argument to be made that financial institutions have had too much power? There's a degree of regulatory capture which then helps to twist the Bretton Woods system against the interests of the majority. We have Howie, who mentioned a very important point. That is that the resilience that we have demonstrated in Asia comes at a very high price of growth that could have delivered substantial welfare improvements to the common man. So is there a system where the Bretton Woods system is dominated by some very large, systemically important central banks who pursue policies that they think are optimal for themselves, but which end up being suboptimal for the whole system as a whole? And that has been a problem for a long time, all this volatility of capital and turbulence and the damage it caused, but nothing has been done to reform it. Through all the evolution and changes and so on, nothing has been done to address this fundamental issue. The system does not serve the interests of the common man. Would you agree, or am I overstating the case? Anyone?
Okay, I'll give it a crack. Well, I don't think the system was set up to address that kind of issue, which is why we don't see it being addressed. The IMF was set up basically to provide stability to the international monetary system. And the way it does this is to make sure that everybody is behaving, pursuing sound policies, have strong balance sheets and all that. And by doing that, the idea is that you then help to promote growth, right? And then there's a trickle-down process that hopefully will benefit the ordinary people. And I think that's a very important process. We shouldn't belittle it, okay? Because I think you look around Asia, per capita income has increased dramatically, right, over the years. China is, of course, a good example of that. And even though there's rising disparity, rising inequality in Asia, I would say that the lower income has benefited enough, right? That they have not, you don't see the kind of anti-globalization movement that we saw in Europe and in the US. So, but it is a real issue, and going forward, it's going to become even more of an issue. We see that in Singapore already. I think somebody mentioned this morning the backlash against foreign workers, right? Which is unfortunate. But there's a perception that foreigners coming in, taking away jobs, and yet, when you ask yourself, if you don't have the foreigners, who's going to do the dirty job, right? If the locals have to do it, then they're not going to be able to move upstream, right? So there's always this tension, for sure. But I think in many countries in Asia, there's definitely a bigger role that the government can play in terms of addressing those issues. In Singapore, for instance, you have the workfare program, you have the social safety net, and it can be strengthened even further, right? We know that technology is a disruptive technology. People get thrown out of job. A few years ago, every time I take a Grab, the guy has been laid off from a marine sector, oil and gas sector, and so people have been thrown off the job, needs to be re-employed, re-skilled, and all that. But it is not a role that IMF is set up to play. Certainly, that's why I said we still can keep the IMF, but we must recognize that it's not enough to address many of the issues that has come up. And so we need to supplement that with more comprehensive social safety net, more generous, especially if the country can afford it. And I think it's going to become a bigger problem over time with the new technology. Thank you.
So, if I may, maybe I add 4 points, Manu. First is a version of Hoi's point, which is if you, because your question has many aspects, unpack it. It's a criticism in one sense of finance, and then I would say, well, it's a criticism of finance, not the system reflects the fact that we have at the global level the Bretton Woods system, but really your question is about finance and banking, right? If you like. Second, I guess there's a part of your question where you sort of say, big countries take advantage of it. I would say before. I would acknowledge that reality, but but it is also true that if you were not part of the system, it would happen anyway, and you would have less of a voice. So it's better, I think the Fed should run its policies for its own, relative to its own mandate. It's not responsible for the rest of the world. But it is good that it does tell people, and it takes input, and so that's the second point. Third point is, I hope it doesn't come the wrong way, but I think it's better for us to recognize that this is a truth of life, which is people have power, they want to get more power, they are selfish, and therefore we need to not believe that people act naive, not naively expect people not to use their power for their own gain, if you like, right? And you build institutions, you build processes around that. And then fourth is just a self-criticism, me as an economist. So this one, I do think I would put at the hands of the Bretton Woods system, just because we are the disciples of the dogma. And that is my generation, right? We are all taught markets are neutral, right? Just liberalize. It will take care of itself. Trade is good. No, unambiguously good, right? In the more extreme version. We were never thought the next step, which is that, yes, we need to create a global financial system, an infrastructure, a set of rules. It has to be tough. Unfortunately, it's not a welfare system in that sense. But then you need to build the next level, which is people will lose jobs. They need transition. They need training. Accidents will happen. People need insurance. All these things were perhaps missing. And if you come from me, like me, from an American school, this is worth 2 seconds of thought, right? Because you don't worry about that. The credit you get was to say that it should always be free.
Thank you.
So I would actually, so I expressed my concern about dollar dominance and debt dominance. But when I've been reading the various reports from the IMF over the years, the various country assessments, I remember reading things about encouraging more flexible labor markets, encouraging lifelong learning, continuing to build the European institutions. I remember all those things. They were all in the reports. The trouble was they weren't implemented. And if we think about the IMF and we think about the global institutions, is it really realistic to give those institutions an opportunity to truly sanction the countries that are not compliant? I mean, we see the challenges even within Europe to have that. And so I think that the international institutions draw their power from the fact that countries see it in their interest to have that cooperation. And I think in that context, the point you make about the common man is important. But I would argue that many of the failings of the common man have come more at the national level rather than at the international level in some respects. So if we think about fairness within countries, if I take the example of the United States, you go back to the early 70s, the top 10% were taking maybe 30% of the income. Today, the top 10% are taking well over 50%. Can we really blame the international institutions for that? I don't think we can. And I think this is where we need to rethink the role of the distribution within societies and the fairness within societies. But it's, income distribution is one aspect of it, but it's also about access to education. Look at the inflation, the price of education in the US. If you want to see where there is inflation, there is a good place to spot it, There is inflation in the world. Probably not where we want it, but it's there. Access to health care. And I think these are really the important things. And I forget who, but someone mentioned at this moment, access to aspiration to do better. And if you think about what protectionism really is, a protectionist is someone who promises you a return to a romanticized past that may or may not have existed. Think about the US. Make America great again. Brexit. Take back control. I'm sort of wondering how they're doing on that, by the way. We'll see tonight what they vote on again. I won't go into Brexit too much. But if I look within Europe, I actually think it's a little bit of a shame that the European institutions were not strong enough to address or even prevent the crisis that we had. And I don't think it would be fair to put that burden on the IMF or the World Bank or anyone else. So I strongly believe that we need strong global institutions. But more than that, I believe that we need strong national institutions and strong regional institutions. And I cannot emphasize that enough in the case of the euro area. Banking union, capital markets union, fiscal union, I've talked about this, strong single market. All of these things are absolutely key. And I really think that if we can move towards a world that's less dominated by the dollar and less dominated by debt, and I know I can't replace all my debt by equity, but if I could get rid of some of the debt, I'd be happy. I actually think we could move ourselves into a stronger position, because what we've really done over the past many years is we've relied on central banks and debt to get us out of many of the crises. And the last crisis we had, well, who did the debt? China. I mean, it's amazing when you think about the numbers. China increased its debt to GDP ratio by over 100%. That's like borrowing on a wow scale. I mean, and it's a lot of fun to borrow and spend. It's a lot less fun when you have to pay it back. And I think this is really the issue today that we need to deal with and address. And so I'm going to disagree with you a little bit, Manu, because I actually think we have good institutions, but I think we need to foster better institutions at the national level and take care of the institutions at the global level.
Thank you, Michaela. It's a free country here, so you can say what you like. Great. I think we should open to the floor, and I'd really encourage you to ask. I have a question over there first. Maybe you'll take that. And we'll take two questions first.
My name is Tommy Barchukov, chairman of Avenir Holdings. I really like your idea, Leslie, about ideas. Ideas travel fast and they are very free. Now, when it comes to what we focus on, institutions, ideas, creativity, implementation is all based upon people, people's attitude, their mindset. Do we focus enough on thinking about people's mindset? Because mindset is part of the culture, culture is strategy for breakfast, etc. So I'm very concerned about the fact that we forget about the mindset, which is a long-term thing we should work on. People like to be trusted, they like to be respected, and they like, as the minister said this morning, they like hope. Do we put enough on that?
Yes. Next question, please.
Thank you. What are your comments for all the panelists? What are your comments and thoughts about China's role played in a global financial and monetary system after China set up this AIIB? Because there are voices about China's China that talk about replacing the current global financial system dominated by the American, and especially given that China's economic growth and influence, and this after its initiation of One Belt, One Road, and China Greater Bay Area. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so first round, two questions. Maybe Leslie can address that direct question to you, and then the others could address the other second question.
I'm not sure if I understood your question, but I would agree with you that, this morning I was talking to my boss, and as maybe some of you know, my boss used to be the head of the Singapore Civil Service, and his pitch these days is that he says we should stop teaching subjects in school. We should teach RICE, R-I-C-E. RICE relates to relationships, teaching our kids to have good relationships, teaching them to be innovative, creative, and entrepreneurial. And I'm not sure if you had the chance to read this book by Kai-Fu Lee. He's an AI specialist. It's really interesting. First half of his book is about AI. Second half of his book is about love. Right? Maybe you're French, you don't need this, but the Singaporeans probably have an issue here. I would say in a world with many machines, right? What do we have, right? And so it's very important. Maybe I'd like to address a bit of the dollar. So talk a bit of economics, dollar. And question by the second speaker, which I think just translates to China is a major economy. Its financial system, in an external sense, relative to this domestic economy and the size of its economy and its domestic financial system, is actually a little stunted, right? By deliberate policy choice. Is this going to change? My answer will be yes, but many things have to happen for it to change, right? It's one, as I said, it's stunted somewhat today by deliberate policy choice, because the Chinese need to handle their internal problems before they open up, right? If they open up at the wrong time, we will have a big crisis. So it's not a question about if. I guess in my mind, it's a question of when and the pace, right? And all of us want to, many Chinese, again, if you think about the Chinese, many Chinese are underinvested in the rest of the world. So lots of money wants to come out of China for good or, for diversification reasons. I guess we say that diplomatically. But even if you didn't have, the desire for safety in that sense, the Chinese need to diversify, right? Because they're overly exposed internally. And a small amount out of China will be a big amount for the rest of us. In Southeast Asia, it will be huge, right? Given the size of the Chinese entities. You can think of Belt and Road as one expression of this. I tend to think of it as a statement of aspiration rather than an actual set of operational strategies. And I guess people can ascribe many motives, but the logic of it kind of makes sense to me. China needs to diversify, it wants to diversify. Then the rest of the world, I would also argue, wants to have a piece of China. So it is quite clear to me the direction. We need to have many things in place, right? As I said, the Chinese themselves have to let go. But then if I were an investor, I want to make sure I can take my money in and I can take my money out. Right? I want to be sure both in terms of costs involved, so it's a question about market structure, liquidity, but also in a political sense, right? I don't want to have a situation where the Chinese could say, oh, sorry, the window to take your money out has closed. That would be a problem if you want to be a major market in that sense. So I guess I don't have much ideological thing except to say that many of these things are determined by the market, policy, and the logic of China's size and potential is, at least to me, very clear.
Well, I'll just add a final thought on that. As I said in my initial comments, I strongly believe that the day the China and Europe both have a genuine international currency, on the flip side of that, we will have had many of the reforms that we would like to see in those respective regions. But I would also argue, but we'll see what happens in the future, I would also argue that it should give for a better balance in the global financial system. If we think about what was initially Greenspan's bond yield conundrum, which later became Bernanke's savings glut, it was really creating the conditions under which the US was benefiting from excessively low interest rates, even in the pre-crisis world. And then, of course, we can couple that with all of the financial deregulation, which clearly went too far, all of those issues. But again, that's not necessarily international. That's as much national institutions that need to think about these things. So I would also argue that in such a system where you have more diverse currency regions, it should also lower some of the imbalances, at least within the regions in the longer term. Now, of course, it depends a lot on how we shape things and how we move forward. But I, again, just want to highlight this point about macroprudential policies. It's a very new thing, and we don't talk that much about it, and it does have many challenges, which I won't go into here. But that recognition that somebody has to be thinking about the buildup of excesses in the financial system, and the macroprudential policies are, again, something that's being developed both at the global level, macroprudential recommendations, the regional level, and the national level. So I think it's a very important policy tool, and I think it's something that we economists need to spend a lot more time on.
Okay, I think it's really hard to displace the US dollar as the de facto currency of the world. I think the Japanese tried to do that in the 90s, they failed. It has to be more or less market driven. And I think what China was doing several years ago in terms of internationalization of the renminbi helps. In the sense that you need to have the infrastructure for settlement of currencies and all that. But after all the effort, the increase in use of renminbi is 3%, 2%. It's really minuscule compared to the US dollar. So unless there is a underlying market, demand for RMB, you're not going to get, RMB developing as an alternative to the US dollar. But I kind of agree with Leslie that the Chinese are actually not quite ready for that to happen. And so, in the last turbulence in 2015, they all pulled back very sharply, because they realized that internationalizing your currency means losing some control over it. In Singapore, we have a non-internationalization policy of the Sing dollar, because partly because our exchange rate is centered around the management of the exchange rate. So, we need to be able to maintain control of the exchange rate. But even for China, right? I mean, if they were to fully internationalize the currency, that will be the day when the exchange rate becomes floating, it's convertible, and that will be the day when, China could very well, share of the global share of RMB could very well increase to 20%. I don't know what that number would be. But it has to be driven by market forces. I just don't see how, you can go make a policy you want to internationalize and make it happen. I just want to make one other point because China is growing so rapidly relative to the developed country that in the next 15 years, they're going to be about 23% of the global economy, bigger than the US, right? So a lot of these things, a lot of changes are going to happen regardless of what happened with anti-globalization, protectionism, because the region is going to integrate around China. I don't see how that's not going to happen. So this morning when we heard about countries in the region being very pro-globalization, there's a risk that the world will break up into blocks where you have the Asia-Pacific region, which is integrating rapidly, regardless of what happens outside. And that trend is going to get stronger and stronger over time, right? And so it may not matter that much, but I think at some point the protectionist forces against integration will diminish relative to the integrating forces driven by China and the rising middle class in the region. Thank you.
So, Manu, could I just add a few things on the dollar? So agreeing with the two speakers, maybe just one thing to know, which is might already be obvious, is the network effect of the dollar, right? The dollar is going to be dominant even if the US is not a major economy because it benefits from the network effects. And if you need historical evidence for that, look at the British pound. The second point to make, though, is a point made by you, which is that again, you can facilitate the use of the dollar. You can also start to create doubt about its use. So some of the extraterritorial actions, the fact that if you use the dollar, you now essentially become under US jurisdiction, which makes the currency maybe more problematic for some places or some actors. These are things to think about, right? And I guess, again, to make this a bit more complete and interesting, there's a whole group of people who believe, that the future is in crypto, right? And this whole group of people have a different issue and a different philosophy, and will essentially say that official issued money, fiat money, is not what we want, at least in the future. So that could, but I don't think that's really a dollar threat. It's just to make this discussion a little bit more complete.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. So I see a hand there. We'll take that question and conclude with that.
Hi, Daniel Moss, columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. When you look at the way the Federal Reserve takes developments around the world into greater account, as symbolized by the rise of Lael Brainerd, the use of euphemisms like cross currents, is that indicative that a kind of post-Bretton Woods world is already here? Or is it indicative of just how far we have to go to get to that world?
Thank you, Daniel. I think what we'll do now is maybe you can address Daniel's question, but also use your final conclusion to just make a few comments to round up. So maybe starting with Hui, Michaela, and then Leslie. Thank you.
Okay. Are we in the post-Bretton Woods?
2 minutes each. 2 minutes each.
Are we in the post-Bretton Woods? The de-globalization that was mentioned by, I think, Rajan this morning. I don't think so. I think, but of course, U.S. administration policy has a big role to play on how the Bretton Woods institution evolve in the future. They may play a smaller role over time relative to what happened. But the world is going to go on regardless of what happens to Bretton Woods. And so in that sense, I think the Bretton Woods can continue to play an important role. But even if we try to revive the Bretton Woods, it will never be the same, right? Because I think there are new forces at play. That's going to be new technology, the emergence of Asia as the center of gravity for economic growth. So I think those are bigger trends that are going to drive the developments. It would be a pity, of course, if the Bretton Woods does not play the role, because I think at the end of the day we live in a globalized economy, and with the global value chain, everybody, it's so amazing that nowadays, I think this has been commented already that any single product you have is made from so many different countries. So it's really a globalized production system that we have in the world. And we need to take recognition of that. And, there are always winners and losers. And I think there's a bigger role that can be played by national government in terms of putting in place a national safety net in order to mitigate the cost to the losers. But, we need to remain open. At least I think the Asia has benefited greatly from globalization, from openness to trade and all that, and should continue to support the multilateral based system. So I'll stop here. Yeah.
So I think when we look at the communication from the Fed, I think the reality is that if we just look at the balance of economic power in the world today, if I go back to thinking about myself as a young economist, which was a long time ago, at that time, basically, emerging markets were not a big problem in building your forecast for the US. What happened in China was pretty much irrelevant. You didn't worry about it. Why? Because China and emerging markets more broadly were not a source of final demand for the United States. I think what's changed substantially over the past 20 to 30 years is that the causality runs both ways now. If we think back to the summer of 2015, there really was just a tiny little movement in the Chinese currency, and it spread panic throughout global financial markets. So we see that if there is a concern in the so-called emerging world, it has huge ramifications for the so-called developed world. And I think that's really what's changed. So when the Fed is conducting its monetary policy, it has to worry much more about the international spillovers, simply because the economic spillovers that come back to the US are huge. So whether this is post-Bretton Woods or not, I started off by saying that for me, Bretton Woods ended in 1971, so I've been post a long time. But I think we're always going to be post something. I made a strong point about the dollar, and I've made quite a strong point about debt as well, and I really do worry about the debt in the world. And I think if we continue down this road of ever more debt, ever lower interest rates, I sort of worry about what negative interest rates could mean if we move to more negative rates over time. And then there's this new thing which is coming up, which is modern monetary theory, which I like to refer to as magic mushroom theory. Because I've sort of drawn the conclusion I no longer have to pay taxes because the central banks are just going to do more QE and finance the governments, right? Well, I think we've had a historical example of how that went really, really wrong. So I think this overburdening of the central banks, it's something we really need to think very hard about. So debt, equity, and central banks. I agree with you. It'll be a long time before the yuan, before the euro really rival the US dollar. But if you think about it, I don't think it's just market-driven. So there I'm going to disagree with you. I think if the Europe creates a genuine safe assets, creates a genuine banking union, creates a genuine capital markets union, we will have created the institutions that will allow for Europe to become. If China pursues the reform, puts more flexibility, opens up its financial system, it will create the conditions, and then I agree with you, the markets play the role. But governments need to create the conditions for that to happen. And I think that's really my new Bretton Woods, where we have the euro, the yuan, the dollar, and who knows, maybe another currency in the equation. So we have a more diversified international currency system. Thank you.
Just to agree with and affirm, I guess, on the question that you asked about the Fed policy function, wouldn't pretend to know what anyone is in particular thinking, but the economic facts are, I think, a bit clearer, which is that the US economy is more sensitive to things that are happening outside the US economy in historical terms, much more than before. And insofar as the Fed is also worried about financial confidence or spillover effects on finance, that's also that's a change from the past. I mean, 3 or 4 years ago, I started, when I would visit New York and talk about the US market, the first chart that would be shown would be China, right? That would not have been the case maybe 10 years ago. So clearly, these are, Fed has to respond because it's actually important both from confidence and from an economic point of view. I guess my ending point is going to be about ideas, and here I would say, especially in Asia, we have benefited from globalization. We need to make the case, in my view, we need to not just make the case, but we need to actually help people understand the benefits of globalization, the benefits of being open, in ways that they can relate to. Not in the way that I, as an economist, have spent most of my career talking about. Not in the way of sometimes when we elites say, you need flexible market. What does that mean? Actually, it means you'll lose your job first. and then what happens after that? Did you think about, do we articulate the next step? Do we help people understand the volatility? Change is bad. Change is also good, right? But we leave them sometimes with the burden of interpreting or dealing with flexible market or competitive markets.
Thank you. I'm pleased to inform you that we have a panel of 3 economists who are not two-handed economists. They've come out with a very clear view. This is not the swan song of the Bretton Woods system. It is still needed and it is still useful. However, the world is changing. It's becoming more complex. But what needs to be done, if I understood you all right, is that we need more national and regional institutions like the AIIB and so on. We need new practices like macro-prudential policies that need to be fleshed out and strengthened. And we need new policies at the national level like social safety nets and so on to make the whole thing work. However, because the Bretton Woods system is still not complete and not completely reformed, given the problems that we heard, like growing debt dominance and so on, there probably will be a few more shocks along the way. So thank you very much, and please reward our one-handed economists with the usual way.